Hey, welcome to the Awakening Report. I'm your host, Doug Hamp. It's a real pleasure to be here again and to spend some time with you guys. I have a special guest tonight. His name is Chad Schafer, and he's written a very interesting book, one that I think is worth a lot of our time. It's called The World in the Bondage of Egypt. And he's making an interesting case about the arches that we see throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. And he co-authored this book with Doug Krieger. And so he is going to give us his understanding of what these are. You know, what are these arches all about? What kind of spiritual significance do they have? And he's making a pretty bold case here that the world, as we know it, is in the bondage of Egypt, and these arches have something to do with that. If you want to say something, love to hear from you. Of course, you can go on to the YouTube comment section, and I'll be monitoring that. You can also check in on Facebook if you're over there, and we'll take your comments. So, hey, Chad, it's really great to have you, man.
Thanks, Doug, for having me on. I'm really looking forward to this first interview with the book. So
Yeah, that's pretty
I may
exciting.
stumble here a little bit, but
No worries. Well, tell me, just first of all, what's the basic gist of the book? I mean, if you can kind of just sum it up for us, kind of a little abstract or something, because this is a pretty big thesis that you've taken on. I mean, you've spent a lot of time, defending your thesis. You got a lot of pictures. You're making a case about these arches. What are you trying to get at?
well, this arch was set up in response to the destruction of Jerusalem, Israel in 70 AD. It was set up as a direct result of that destruction under Titus, and the connection is simply this: we are very familiar, the scriptures, those who have been believers all our lives, we know what the scriptures say, and we see that.
Mm-hmm.
Out the Hebrew scriptures, we see always a bit against the idols, the monuments, and the totems are up. Uh, we know from the New Testament scriptures that, it's not these things that have the power, but the entities that are behind them that have the power. Obviously, there was something meant by them when the world kingdom set them up. But what was meant by them? We don't spend a lot of time thinking about those kind of things. Struck me
So,
was that here.
yeah, and so let me just kind of interject here. I mean, when I've been to both to Rome and to Paris. I've actually seen the Arc de Triomphe, and I've seen obviously the one there in Rome, the Triumphal Arch of Titus. Okay, the TAOT as you put it in your book. And I mean, why can't it just be something that's a commemoration of what they did? This is kind of in style, and they made this nice arch. Why does it have to be anything more?
Well, it was set up directly as a result of prophecy. That's the first that should catch our attention. And most people, when they think of the prophecies that being fulfilled, think of Matthew 24, Luke chapter 21, or in those verses that talk about where Jesus was talking with his disciples. That whole conversation in Matthew 24 starts with asking Jesus to look at all the temple grounds and the marvelous buildings. He makes Jesus, and that's coming upon them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're
So,
having a little bit of trouble hearing you, Chad. I'm sorry about that, but so I'm going to have to just go back and kind of go through your statements a little bit, just so that we can hear those a little bit. But you're making the case about Matthew 24, and you're saying that the arches are in fulfillment to what we have in Scripture. How is an arch a fulfillment of Scripture?
well, it's not so much. Um, that the arch itself has any significant meaning other than its connection, in that it was set up by in opposition to Jerusalem. In the scripture, to see that significance, we look at Matthew 24. Yeshua referred to Daniel. He's being fulfilled there. Daniel, scriptures of Jeremiah, perhaps sometimes people will go to that when they discuss those verses, but more often than not, Daniel, you have to get his mindset. He was looking for their sojourn in Babylon was going to be over. He was trying to seek out an answer to that. He was seeking Jeremiah.
So just give us your thesis really quick here, because I want us to be able to understand,
Okay.
what's your thesis statement that you're trying to prove in the book?
This is simply this: the Arch of Triumph is representative of Egypt. Rome had conquered Egypt prior to their conquering of Jerusalem. Of Rome was not only just the Caesar of Rome, he also had the title of Pharaoh because he had conquered Egypt at the conquering of Egypt.
Okay, I got it. So because Caesar had also conquered Egypt and he had the title of Pharaoh, therefore, when it says in Scripture, in Deuteronomy and other places, that you will go back to Egypt, I will send you back by the way that you came, you will go back to Egypt. You're saying that at least in partial, perhaps more, but at least in part fulfillment of that when they went to Rome, they were, in a sense, going back to Egypt. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct. And there's plenty of examples in scriptures that show us exactly how that was fulfilled in direct opposition that were laid out. At the end of Deuteronomy, he tells them specifically, they will be returned unto Egypt. And he gave the Torah. It didn't happen until many years later, but it did happen. And I give examples of that. He says, interestingly, by the way that I told you, you would be returned. There's several examples in the scripture where we can see line by line exactly how that happened. First one you can see is there were two crossings when they came out of Egypt. Across the Red Sea to the Jordan, across the Jordan into the land of Canaan, which became the land of Israel. Well, that return at the destruction of, which was just Judah and some of the Benjamites at the time, first manner, they were taking over down into Egypt with Titus first, at some of the Roman legions back to their posts that were stationed there, the 5th and the 15th, I believe. Again, the Mediterranean up into Rome. A reversal of the crossings going into Israel. The same thing happened when they roamed in their slavery. They crossed the Mediterranean twice. An aspect of this that epitomizes is that I trace in the book, and I go through and give the examples and trace the gold. It's always a question, why important that the scripture should mention the gold in so many different places? That gold and silver that was used, that was given to them or taken from the Egyptians upon their exodus, was used to make the temple accoutrements in the desert, only in Solomon's temple. That gold was then again taken when Babylon conquered them and put in the vaults of eventually Nebuchadnezzar II. Using those same the plates and the dishes, the night that they would have destroyed, taken and put back into Jerusalem, used in the second temple, and was still there when Titus destroyed it. Taken. So it's not just any gold that was taken, gold that came with them out of Egypt. So we have a second example. A third one. Passover was instituted, and it became the first of months in Egypt upon their exodus. Happened, which saved them from death, their firstborn. And when Titus came to conquer Jerusalem, it's noted in Josephus notes this, and minor records note this too, that it was on Passover that, and so that very institution of Passover, which had saved them from death, had drawn all the peoples in country by Josephus in Titus, that never so many people had been in a city that they had taken before. So the very institution of Passover, which had saved them from death to their deaths in Jerusalem when Titus conquered it, the whole city was made in replica by the Romans and paraded and then commemorated upon this triumphal arch of Titus. You can actually look along the inside walls of the Arch of Titus, and you can see pictures parading the temple upon its walls. So any monument to victory here and there, you could say, you know, whatever. It's so tied to what we see in scriptures, the fact that the very commemoration, they built entire replicas of the temple and the buildings in Jerusalem and paraded them through the arch. So if you look at the blessings, we should be familiar with the blessings line by line, you know, God laid out.
Well, let me just summarize for really quick here. So okay, so what I've gotten so far and what I was getting from the book, but again, just for the sake of our readers, and we do apologize that our connection is a little bit sketchy. Apologize about that, but we did try. So what you're saying then is the very things that God did for them, taking them out of Egypt on Passover, which saved their lives from the angel of death, took out all the gold. You know, I mean, it's incredible how they plundered Egypt. I mean, it's just phenomenal. And that is actually in the Ipuwer Papyrus, by the way, an Egyptian document talking about how these slaves plundered the Egyptians. They asked the women for their gold and everything, and by that time the people were just done. They're like, just get out of here, we'll pay you to leave. And so they took a lot of gold from Egypt. So now what you're saying is that because the Romans, not only did they take the people of Judah, but they made these replicas and they paraded them through this Arch of Titus. And because Caesar was also the Pharaoh, they're literally returning all this stuff back to Egypt. Is that correct?
Yes, and not only this, but also had incorporated also their religion of Egypt. The same gods. I trace this in the book, just how you can go from the gods that they worshiped were instituted in Rome. Gold, when it was first brought, was placed in the pantheon. Essentially the same gods by different names that the Egyptians worship. So have a complete undoing. Statistically, it would seem impossible that so many years later, you could historically document everything that the Lord blessed them with was done. It's antithetical. It was amazing. It absolutely would be impossible to come up with anything that would be so perfect in its undoing. A reversal of the Exodus took place. Not only that, but the triumphal arch of Titus. You know, I make the argument as well here. Many cities that sit upon 7 hills throughout the world. Can't hear me too well. Also claims to be a city on 7 hills.
I'm sorry, which city? Say the city again, besides Rome?
Israel, Jerusalem.
Okay, Israel. Right, okay. Yeah.
Israel. is a city also on 7 hills.
Hmm.
For the most holy hill, obviously, is Mount Zion, where the temple set. 2 is a city of 7 hills. Hal Lindsey made this very 70s with his book. So that's more well known, but a lot of people don't know that Jerusalem is a city in 7 hills. Hill, and their highest hill is the Valian Way hill. And that hill is occupied by the Triumphal Arch of Titus. Though there are temples there, but the highest point by the Arch of Titus. It sits in opposition to the city of Jerusalem. There are so many ways, and I document a lot of them, but it just sits in antithesis against Jerusalem and Israel in that way. So,
Wow. That's amazing. It's phenomenal. I mean, this is really powerful to suggest that they were taken back. But why do you think they were taken back? I mean, God made these incredible promises, so why would he allow them to go back? Is it just because they said, not all of them, but some of them said no to Jesus, or is there a bigger picture that's happening?
there's a much bigger picture. I give a very strong case. I present my case, all associated with what we call the gospel today. The verse of Israel has confused, I think, many of the Bible commentators today. There are many people who speak about this, but it's very important. Terminology we use today confused first with just who Israel is. The land of Israel, Ephraim, who was called Israel, the northern tribe. Are you talking about Judah today? The world calls Israel. Who is Israel? Who is Judah? It's very clear that Israel, after the divorce, only spoke about the northern tribes. It was Judah, were the southern tribes of the conquering Jerusalem in 70 AD. The Jews and some of the Benjamites were the only ones who occupied that land. This isn't the contention I make in the book, pub.com, or any of the commentaries, Deuteronomy 29 passages. They'll tell you that 70 AD conquering fulfilled that passage, but there's a very key element that's missing from that. The promise was made that Israel would be returned to Egypt. Destruction of 70 AD, present.
So we of course we have the divorce of the northern kingdom, as you just pointed out, in 722. Judah was taken into exile, but they were brought back after 70 years. So are you suggesting that first the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes, went into the diaspora, and they were scattered, and they were returned to Egypt, and then later on we have Judah basically joining their Ephraimite brothers in the diaspora in 70.
It is actually backwards from that one than what we perceive, because to first, and this is the claim and how I go through this in the book. The Arch of Titus was not the only arch built, so its representation of Egypt was well established when they were conquered in 70 AD. Dispersed were, and that's where I pick up in a succession of conquerors thereafter. Was the only one in the land, and the promise was that all would be returned into Egypt. Spiritually, there was a legal authority, the adversary and the spiritual forces, then to bring the rest of the diaspora into Egypt. Since conquering, then Egypt.
Maybe we lost you,
Can you
Chad. Okay,
note?
we're really having trouble. I'm really sorry about that. Because you
Let
have
me
some great.
switch headphones here.
Okay, because I know you have some great things that you want to share, and I've been listening. Maybe just take out the headphones. Maybe that'd solve the problem. So
Is
again, we're talking with Chad Schafer, and he is sharing with us from his book, "The World in the Bondage of Egypt Under the Triumphal Arch of Titus," and making the case here in this book. You can get this. This is available at TribNet and other locations. I'm not sure if it's on Amazon yet, but I bet it is. But the point here is what Chad is saying is that what happened when God took Israel out of Egypt, and then he said, if you are not faithful to me and you continue to go back, and they did, they were completely unfaithful. I want you to understand that it wasn't about the times where they stole, or they committed adultery, or just things that they shouldn't have done, but it was because they were not faithful to the one who had married them at Mount Sinai, and they were in a completely spiritually adulterous status, and that God said, okay, I'm going to take you out of the land, I'm going to cast you out of my house, and you will go back. And so he promised that they would go back to Egypt, and that is exactly what happened. And so what Chad is doing is he's coming in and kind of putting some of the pieces together and saying, look, what happened is they actually went back literally to Egypt. They didn't have to go back to the very land of Egypt, but because now Egypt was under the control and the domination of Rome, and because Caesar had the title of Pharaoh, that now that 70 was really the fulfillment of them being in exile. And understand that their Ephraimite brothers were taken away in 722 BC, and then Judah got a reprieve, but things didn't change, and so then they went into a full exile in 70 AD. So that's just kind of catching us up there. I I hope that makes good sense there, Chad. I went ahead and muted you. If you want to unmute yourself, that'll help us get you back on here. But again, Chad Schafer sharing with us
okay?
his
Can you
book.
hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. So go ahead.
Okay, so Judah has gone and been returned to Egypt, that all of Israel would be returned. And since they had been dispersed and grafted into the nations, of all of them couldn't have been fully filled 70 AD. Only a small portion of them were returned into Egypt at that time. Then there has to be more. And I think, my opinion is, reason for the last 2,000 years, we have seen expand and take over the world. The Arch of Titus was not the only arch to be built. That followed it, the Arc de Triomphe in France under Napoleon, another arch. And he only built that arch immediately after conquering the same lands. His first place to conquer, Alexandria, Egypt, named after Alexander. Most of us connect as part of the Babylon B system. And first, now, if you think about places you're going to try to conquer, if you're a king or a general in a country as far placed away as France, why on earth would make you think Alexandria, Egypt first? It logistically, the world make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
It makes
Yeah.
perfect sense. He conquers the same lands.
I've got a couple of questions here in the chat room, and I thought this might be kind of fun. normally I'd love for you to go on, but it is a little bit tough with the cutouts and stuff. But one person's asked a question: is there any significance to the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, Missouri?
It's not as particular, other than it is an arch. But we have two other arches, and this was a part of the later arch. The Soldiers and Sailors Arch, the Washington Arch. After wars, but that's a little bit ahead of it. So there is a succession of conquerors who are stylistically modeled upon the Arch of Titus, built by successive conquerors of previous nations who had built the arch, tied by conquering all back to the Arch of Titus that was constructed in 70 AD. I want to make about this. Of these arches are still standing. They're still standing. That's a long time for anything to remain intact.
Yeah, it's a very long time. I want to fast forward a little bit. You have a chapter called "Of Marriage and Divorce." Can you tell us a little bit about that chapter? What are you getting at in relation to this wider thesis that you've made?
Well, that's the whole premise of this. Just as you've stated, and I know your listeners are very familiar with, the divorce is integral. It is integral. Specifically, Romans chapter 12, he talks about Israel and Judah being plucked off of the olive tree, and then if he's plucked them off, to graft that into the Gentiles, the Goyim. And so the divorce, in that God said he would return unto Egypt, the dispersion, putting away, he could show mercy to all, just as Paul has stated. The reason for the come under bondage and will come under bondage is so that he might show mercy to all. A legal, spiritual proposition that God has put here. He do things on a whim. He still follows his own precepts, his own laws, his righteousness. His word is himself. To be a way to do this. The world coming under the bondage of Egypt is so that he might show mercy to all. It's part of the gospel.
Wow. So who got divorced, though? I mean,
Israel, the northern 10 tribes,
okay.
they were the ones who were divorced. Divorced, though she was guilty of worse crimes, the scripture says she was worse. He followed after and did even worse, but he didn't put her away because of the promises that had been made that the Messiah would come through the line of Judah. The promise was then again repeated to David. The Messiah would come through their line. She had not been divorced. She became a widow by her own hand when Yeshua.
Wow. Now that's powerful. So Judah effectively became a widow by her own hand. Essentially, Judah killed her husband. Is kind of what you're saying.
I can't see it any other way.
Okay. That's interesting. You know, I mean, that's certainly one take on it. I've kind of thought that, you know, one perspective I've had is that when Judah was an unfaithful wife, which is very, very clear from the text, and in Numbers chapter 5, there's a whole scenario about what to do when a husband feels that his wife has been unfaithful and that she is to drink the bitter water. I believe it was Psalm 119 Ministries made the case that Jesus essentially became the adulterous wife. You know, he drank the bitter waters. You know, so he took that role But what you're saying is a bit different than that. You're saying that no, here you have the wife that has not been divorced is clearly an adulteress, Judah, but she's not been divorced, and she then actually kills her husband, and so she becomes a widow, whereas the northern kingdom had become a divorcee, and it's through his death and of course his resurrection that now both of those can come back together, one a widow, one a divorcee, and can get married and be one happy family again. Is that the idea?
Exactly. He was the Messiah. He did take on that role, but he was also a Jew. So it's both. It doesn't have to be and or. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. It's fulfilling the role on behalf of them and us and him and our desire. You know, when we think of who was the one who betrayed, yes, he had his own goal. Temple priests had their for him, but it fulfilled God's desire as well, and now that we know about it. So we have two conflicting, seemingly conflicting goals that are fulfilled in one act. I desire. They had outcomes, obviously, was good for us in and of itself the same. For the scattering was the this world's desire to fulfill their will. It's fulfilling God's will. Or they have a desire. Who are you going to believe? What they boast, what the world boasts? We reign as leaders. Or are you going to believe the gospel that's put forth in the scriptures? We have a choice to believe the voice we want to hear. You can believe the lie, or you can believe the truth.
So true. Speaking of liars, I'm interested in the Arch and the Antichrist. What are you suggesting in that chapter? By the way, you guys, we're talking about Chad Schafer's book, The World in the Bondage of Egypt Under the Triumphal Arch of Titus, making the case that when the Romans captured and took the Jews into bondage and made replicas of the temple and their city and marched them through, as well as the gold, marched them through the Triumphal Arch of Titus, they were effectively being returned to Egypt just as God had promised. They were the last of the unfaithful wife that had to return to bondage. You go back into Egypt because their older brother or sister, northern Israel, had already gone some 700 and 800 years and 811 years before. So basically we come up to this point where now the rest of the clan, Judah, is being returned to Egypt. So yeah, tell us about that chapter, will you?
Yeah, the Arch of the Antichrist is, and I think this is where people who are again familiar with what you have said regarding the coming of the Messiah in which video it was of yours, Doug, when you did the example of Yeshua's returning and the mountain being splitting and split in two. Escape. It was very good visual. I loved how you did that. But the Bible also gives us a very descriptive description. The people of Israel, when they fled from Egypt, part of the Red Sea, we forget the details that the scriptures tells us that the angel of the Lord was in the center of the Red Sea. It said he was over and above, lit a path, making the way bright and clear for Israel as they escaped, but it was dark and stormy for those who were pressing in.
Right.
Looked The Bible uses very specific language. It says he looked down through the clouds, advancing the waters upon them to destroy them. In the Arch of Titus, if you can picture what those, we've all seen the Exodus pictures, you know, how everybody's graphically, those waters standing up on either side. That imagery in stone in the Arch of Titus. Titus, in stone, the very picture of that Exodus, including in the center, in the very center of the Arch of Titus, we see the apotheosis, excuse me, of Titus. So in the very center, in the very same place that the Bible tells us Yeshua occupied upon the Exodus. We have that image replete. What is apotheosis? It's deification. It's God. It's the very things we see are going.
Yeah, Chad, I'm pulling up those images. I just wanted to show people, assuming my computer works here. It looks like it's frozen. But I wanted to show people what those pictures actually look like, so that we can just have a look at those. Sorry, my computer's taking its time now. Isn't that amazing? You gotta love technology. It works a lot of the times, and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes it's operator error, so you never know. Is it me or is it the computer? But
certain. Yeah,
so
as those pop up, as Doug is getting those to pop up, I'll just keep talking.
Please.
Apotheosis, this man becoming God, or what we would call deification. Every description that we're given of the very first fall, of course, the very first time that man would become God, which is kind of a very, very subtle, they already had, but it's man becoming God. And we see this today, and it's very popular, the transhumanism, you know, that many are talking about today, this promise of man becoming God. They had that practice. It was epitomized and legitimized in stone of Titus becoming an immortal, taking his place among the gods. Day, which we know was there, was above the Arch of Titus. There was a 4-horse-drawn chariot. Janus. It was removed when it was the Arch of Titus was built as a defensive wall. Much later, the chariot was removed, but you still have the apotheosis there. That very same thing was repeated in France under Napoleon. It was done in a different way, but it's much more significant in its esoteric meaning. Have a lot more detail, a lot more description of just how that took place, because aware of the ancient pagan practices, really going to miss how that was accomplished at Triumph in France. Triumph in France, there, what is the Unknown Soldier Memorial. Unknown Soldiers Memorial, it's a blocked off sacred space, the eternal flame. Eternal flame. Eternal flame being lit. It was the first one lit sphere since it was extinguished in Rome. Flame, right? All right. Oh, and the names are escaping me now. Of course they are. the priestesses who, oh gosh.
No worries.
But that sacred space was created to, and it's to the unknown soldier, to how in esoteric knowledge we know of its existence. And back in the biblical days, we remember those famous Paul fronted by in the esoteric knowledge gatherers, and they had an inscription to the unknown God, right? Paul tells us exactly who that representative of the one true God, the name they did not know. But to them, something else presented an allegory, particular person, and I tie that to being Nimrod. You've talked about it. I know other authors have talked about it. Rob Skiba, many others. How Nimrod was really the figure being spoken about because the nations were scattered at the fall of Babylon. They all had the same story, and so really, this unknown God. I make the case that the unknown. Uh-oh. Did I
I'm
lose
still
it?
here. No, I'm still here.
Okay.
Can you see the pictures?
All right.
I just want to show people the Arch of Titus.
If you look at the picture in the very bottom left-hand corner there, yes, you see the big square in the middle. It's kind of hard to see there, but there is the apotheosis of Titus. You have Titus sitting, interestingly enough, on the eagle. So he was taken, placed among the gods on eagle's wings. So that's very interesting. So that was replicated in a different manner, which followed after. We had the sacred space of the unknown soldier. The eternal flame was lit, in essence, to the unknown soldier. It was lit on Armistice Day, which was the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour, second, I think, is when they did it, which I tie back to standings and the means of that. So all that in the book, but the apotheosis is essentially them making the boast of God, which very clearly is going to happen at the end of the day. We know this Antichrist figure is going to be. It just boggles my mind why kingdoms who supposedly have nothing to do with Israel and don't know their God are working so hard to fulfill the promises that are written in the scripture and to display that openly.
Wow.
It makes they continue to do so.
That's amazing. We have a question from somebody. I think it's just a clarification. He says, Doug, is the author asserting that the title of Pharaoh was bequeathed upon Caesar upon his vanquishment of Egypt? What qualifications does the author have in ancient history? So you can go ahead and answer.
That's easier. Used to happen much more frequently, not so much in our day because we don't have kings very far back in history. Look at the English and the European monarchies there. To be played in our TV too. They would announce the king, right? He was being announced into the room, and you had to wait 15 minutes for his titles to be read. Well, how did that king get all those titles? Well, those titles were inherited. Conquered the land. He conquered that people. And by authority, by conquering the land, legally, that were held by this ruler. So it's succession. It's simply law of succession. Documented throughout history for years and years. You conquer the land, you inherit the title.
That's just how it goes. If you win, you get to keep the crown, right?
You keep the crown, you keep the title. The leaders, they had local rulers that were installed in Egypt. Anybody can go and look this history up. Themselves as pharaohs. Genius reason for doing that. You adopt the customs, the religion of the people. You know, as you sit on the throne, they're going to be much easier to manage, right? Away their people's identity, they're going to be much more willing to follow you. It's just easier to get along. Right? So the way it is.
Yeah, no, it makes good sense. And Yeah, I mean, I completely concur with what you're saying there. This is, this is not unknown at all. This is just what happened, is that people did take on that title of whatever land they had conquered. And so, again, by virtue of conquering Egypt, you took on the title. Keep in mind that the Ptolemaic Empire, which were Greeks, okay, so this is right after Alexander the Great, right? These guys are Greek, they're not Egyptian, and they go into Egypt, and what do? They take on all of the attributes of Pharaoh, right? So, so the though these were now Greek pharaohs, they were not Egyptian pharaohs, but they still continued to be pharaohs. So, again, you're definitely good standing. It was a good question. It's a good point of clarification, and I think you answered it very nicely. So, yeah, go on. I mean, so okay, we now have. Well, I mean, kind of tell us, because we're running out of time here, but tell us how this all ends. I mean, you've now made the case that Egypt has been. Israel is gone into Egypt because of Rome, who Rome is, and now they've been taken away. Uh, how does this story end?
Well, I go through that, and I'll go quickly through that. But through a succession of conquerors, and I give all the information in the book, there were arches that were built throughout the world by successive, all in order, occupied these by these archers. I make the case that because the archers occupy the land, they can't mean anything else than what the original arches, the world, those who built them obviously felt that way. So they rule to construct them. That the world has been overtaken by the arches of Egypt, lies of Egypt.
Hmm.
The scriptures tell us very descriptively, many places throughout the Torah, that there is going to be a regathering at the end of days in his people on that day, on that last day. There's so many verses. It's there. I'm going to gather you from corners
Yeah.
of the earth, from the east and the west. That gathering. Well,
Yes.
scripture in particular that tells us that he says he uses the scripture itself uses the Exodus to describe it. Our fathers, the boast of the people, essentially was the greatness and how I displayed my power. Be like that, but so much greater. In other words, the second Exodus, he uses the Exodus as his comparison by example, contrast by example. The second Exodus here at my second coming.
Wow.
The world has come under the bondage of Egypt. It's no longer something that you have to spiritualize those verses with. It's not just spiritual language being used here. It's literal language here.
No, I
World
like that.
is Egypt.
That excites me because, I certainly believe in the spiritual realm, and there are weird things happening in the spiritual realm, things that are beyond our understanding, and some things we can understand, but we don't live in that spiritual realm. We live right here, and God has given us instructions and laws and whatnot that govern this domain. And so now what you're saying is that clearly we all know that there's a spiritual understanding of this, but there's a physical here, boots on the ground, on the earth now reality to this, that not only is there a spiritual allegorical understanding, because that's what happens with the word spiritual, is it becomes very allegorical, whereas you're saying no, this is hardcore, literal, physical kind of stuff that happened here on this planet. And then when Jesus comes back, because you literally have a dispersion of all 12 tribes throughout the entire world. And because these arches of Titus and then many, many others, and again, you show those in your book. I mean, you have, just arch after arch, that you're making the case here that these arches. Now, let me just, this kind of a point of clarification. Are all these arches to be understood as a copy of Rome? I mean, can nobody have?
Well, it's not just my opinion on these. If you look at the histories, every one of them, almost down to the last one, will tell you they were modeled on the Arch of Titus. That's my opinion. They were. Though there's some minute details that might be different kind of brick that might have been used. The design was copied from the Arch of Titus. So it's not just my opinion.
Okay, I appreciate that. You have one from India. That was also based on the Arch of Titus? Okay.
It was built based on the soldiers they lot because they had committed people to wars that were fought by the Allies during World War II.
Wow. Okay.
So
interesting. What about the ones made by the Muslims? Are those also a copy?
Was Kevin? I'm sorry.
I thought I saw one a Muslim arch. Did I not see something in there? Was Muslim?
It's actually, I go into in the midst of this book. Your listeners may be familiar with charisma and how just in recent history I had to rewrite that chapter 3 times because news kept happening as I was trying to write the book. But the Arch of Baal that was being erected, in Times Square and then Trafalgar Square, at last minute because the Russians had liberated Palmyra. Baal Arch being erected. Now, what replica is being used?
Yeah, and here's the picture I was thinking of. This is the Arch of Baal in Palmyra, Syria.
Yeah, so the top one is the Arch of Baal. The bottom right-hand one there was the Arch of Severus. It's used for the Triumphal Arch. So instead of the Arch of Baal being now replicated and taken throughout the world, we have the Arch of Severus, which is also based now being taken throughout the world.
That's amazing. You've done a lot of work. I'm quite impressed here. You've really put a lot of work into this. Now you have a picture here of the Ishtar Gate. Clearly, that's before the Romans. How does that figure into your thesis?
Well, the Ishtar Gate, again, arches were before the Romans built them. People often attribute the Romans with the construction of the Ark, but that's not true. They actually got from the Etruscans who were there before they were around for a long, long time. Obviously, they're in Babylon. The structure, I don't know if you can hold that picture up again, is very much similar to the Arch of Titus one. We have a repeat of performance.
Right. I mean, to some extent, you just need arches because that's how you build gateways, right? I mean, it's just a very physical structure, and you have to have something to hold up. So I'm just wondering if every arch, if we're supposed to be leery of it, or if some arches are just pure architecture, but others, there
is a spiritual significance to them. My thought on that first, but when Israel was conquered, Judah was conquered the first time and taken to Babylon, that too also took place on Passover. The temple implements the nation of Israel in total. Obviously, they were conquered over a period of years. They weren't taken all at once. They were given mercy even in the taking of the city. It didn't happen all at once. They were given warning, and they defied, and he said, "Fine, I'm taking you all now." Right? So, it happened on the Passover. Implements preceded the people. itself is esoteric understanding, and this is where detail as possible to how we are to understand the metaphysical reality of represented the temple. So you have the arch, right? It signified this connection and division inside the city and outside the city. Our mind separated heavens from earth spiritually. It performed that same function that the temple was doing in reality, because here we had God who exists in the spiritual realm, which is still a reality, even if what that means or consists of, right? Holiest of holies was the place where man and God met. Vision was taking place. It's both divided, the spiritual reality and the earthly reality. Place of division. So where it did in the arch does as a physical representation of what actually took place as the temple. So it stands in antithesis. Look at this as I'll be real quick here. Think of this another way.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Look at an arch in a house, right? Just any way in a house. It stands in the midst of that arch, in the middle of that arch, if it's broad enough. A person can be literally in a house and yet not in any of the rooms. Firstly, a person could say to be standing in the midst of the arch could be occupying both rooms at the same time. So we have this concept as it's simply a physical explanation of a spiritual concept, both inside and outside of time. With that language in the scripture, we say what God is everywhere. He is everywhere at once. This in a singular place. That concept is what's being displayed through the arch. It both divides both earthly and physical space and metaphysically spiritual and earthly space.
Mm-hmm.
The arch
Interesting.
is,
Yeah. So kind of sum up for us. I mean, just the scriptural. What would you say is one of the strongest scriptural references that would really help us to see how that this is the fulfillment?
well, let's just go back to and read those verses in Deuteronomy that he tells us exactly what's going to take place here.
Which verse are you thinking of?
Right? Go first to Deuteronomy 28:27.
Okay.
We'll start there.
All right. The Lord will strike you with the boils of Egypt, with tumors, and the scab, and with the itch from which you cannot be healed.
Right. And so then if you move on, it's those whole verses 27 through 52. I won't make you read all of them, but you can pick that up again.
Okay.
And he will besiege thee at all thy gates.
Okay. Okay. So in other words, obviously Israel was taken out of the land. God says he's going to send them to Egypt. And yet we don't appear to see them going back to the very land, the heartland of Egypt. So how can that be? Is that kind of the idea?
Well, right. How can that be? How can that be the fulfillment? But you read those verses in Deuteronomy, he says, then Yahweh will make thy plagues wonderful, and the plagues of thy seed, even great plagues and long continuance, sore sickness. He bring upon thee all the diseases of Egypt. Right? We see in the book of Revelation of many of the plagues that we saw that came upon Egypt during that time right prior to the Exodus, right? But it wasn't just they were against the gods, right? We see that in the I'm against the gods of Egypt.
Right.
So we have to ask that very logical question. If we are seeing plagues being repeated in the book of Revelation, God doesn't just do things, right? He's not he's going to do something that he's not going to tell us about first.
Mm-hmm.
We see the repeat of those plagues. Why?
Yeah.
Same gods now are in control of the world.
Okay.
I think for me, what's the most exciting thing about this? Now, if what I propose is true, then the pattern of the Exodus is the same pattern we're going to be seeing at the end of days, this end of time. Same pattern repeated and in the same order. You know, people can take that for what they will.
And I think there's just one more issue that I think would help to button up this whole thesis. And again, I think this causes some confusion, but Judah is not the sum total of Israel, right? So,
That's
you know,
correct.
again, we have this divorce that happened. Well, we have the split that happens in in Israel in 922 BC. We now have this northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is taken away in 722 BC. Judah is left there. They're given a reprieve. They're taken into captivity. They're brought back. And then they are taken into, you know, the diaspora for all, you know. So now we have all 12 tribes. Um, Tell us about Ephraim. I mean, what do you think happened to Ephraim? Are there just like little pockets of them sitting around the world somewhere, or were they assimilated into the nations, or how did that happen?
Well, I the first one, a lot of people, though it can be, I don't deny that there can't be, literally dispersed, grafted in genetically. That's not British Israelism or any of those other that I think are out there, though I think God knows who genetically are the lineage. I don't think there's any doubt to that. But they were grafted into the nations, literally scattered, not being able to genetic history back 2,000 years very well could be descendants. Who's to say, right? I mean, now they can be doing all kinds of testing and whatnot. But so here's to sum up. Could not have gone into Egypt of 70 AD. Only Judah did. And since only Judah went to Egypt at that time, and lawfully the rest of Israel had to go into Egypt. And since they weren't there to go into Egypt, them. It's the very first warnings that were given. Yeshua is talking to the in the vision. He says, "I'm against the Nicolaitan." In short, conqueror. I'm against the conqueror. Right? Why? Very strange. I'm against the conqueror. Thesis is correct. He's against the conqueror, and the warning is to not take part of the deeds of the Nicolaitans. He's saying in the conquering deeds. Why? Because all the successive kingdoms conquered, which expanded the kingdom of Egypt, of Pharaoh. So now the whole world were dispersed before 70 AD have literally being returned to Egypt. They couldn't go to Egypt. Egypt came to them. Promise.
Wow. Wow. Well, Chad, I want to thank you for coming on and sharing a very provocative book. Where can people get this book?
They can get it on Amazon, as you said. You can go to my website, thearchesofegypt.com. That's all one word, www.thearchesofegypt.com.
Okay.
Special promotion for your listeners for the next week. Anybody who uses promo code AWAKENING, AKENING, and the code will get a off the total price, which is effectively a shipping autographed copy from me if they go there on Amazon or at my website. I encourage everybody to obviously to come to my website. I'd like to send it to you, and but they can get it either place.
That's fantastic. Fantastic. Well, again, thank you so much, everybody. The World in the Bondage of Egypt, very provocative case Chad is making. I think it has a lot of merit, Chad, and I appreciate you taking the time to share with us. I appreciate all the effort you put into this book. As we all know, writing a book, at least a good one, it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, a lot of work, and so you're to be commended for that. Give greetings to Doug Krieger, your co-author. I guess he contributed there, so that's fantastic. Everybody stay in the Word. The good news is that Jesus is coming, I hope one day very soon, and he'll set up his kingdom. He'll do away with Egypt and all that stuff. So we have a lot to look forward to. Um, God bless everybody. I hope you have just a great week, and we'll see you next time. Take care.